The House January 6 committee unanimously approved criminal referrals for the former president and several of his allies for their alleged efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Republican Vice Chairwoman Liz Cheney called Trump's inaction during the insurrection, quote, shameful.
During this time, law enforcement agents were attacked and seriously injured. The Capitol was invaded, the electoral count was halted, and the lives of those in the Capitol were put at risk. In addition to being unlawful, as described in our report, this was an utter moral failure and a clear dereliction of duty.
For deeper analysis on this, I'm joined by Jeremi Suri. He's a professor of history and public affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. He's also the author of Civil War by Other Means, America's Long and Unfinished Fight for Democracy. Jeremi, I wanted to start with what Congresswoman Cheney said, which was highlighting the moral failure of the president. It seems like in addition to an exploration of exactly what President Trump and his allies did, this was also a set of hearings about where the line is and whether there is an agreed upon line for moral failures in office.
Absolutely, John. I think this was an investigation and an exploration of where we believe the appropriate line is in our checks and balances. How far can the president go in using the personal power that acquires to that office from holding the executive agencies, having control over the U.S. military, the various other privileges and roles the president has? How far can the president go? And where does Congress appropriately check the president's power?
Put these hearings in historical perspective. So on the one hand, a lot of people have talked about Watergate. Watergate was an unspooling of things that we discovered. There have been some discoveries in this, but the president was there for everyone to see, doing what he's been named to do. So that's part of it. Also, it seems like, or do you think that they are like the hearings during the communist era, the Army McCarthy House On-American Activities, where the hearings tell us something about the times we're in, more than anything else? Or is it a combination of the two?
I don't think this is anything like the Army McCarthy hearings, which were actually designed to invent facts and to basically undermine the reputation of mostly upstanding American citizens. This was nothing of the sort. This was much more like what you said, John, the Watergate hearings in 1974 conducted by the House Judiciary Committee and the Senate Select Committee. These were fact-finding hearings designed to bring out to the American public as best as possible the available facts. And the members of the committee made a case. But even reading their executive summary today, it's filled with detailed evidence. There are no unsubstantiated allegations at all. So this is very much like the Watergate hearings of '74, or perhaps like the 9/11 investigation that we saw after the terrible terrorist attacks of September 11th.
There is some conventional wisdom that Nixon would not have been driven from office if he were existing in today's political environment. Do you buy that? And if so, give me some of the component reasons why that might or might not have been the case.
Well, I think the current Republican Party would be unlikely to take action against a Republican president. I mean, it appears as if they're unwilling to take any action against someone from their own party, especially someone who's quite popular within their own party. And Nixon was perhaps not as popular as Trump was in the Republican Party, but Nixon was quite popular. However, Nixon would have been subjected to criminal prosecution in the same way that Donald Trump will be subjected to criminal prosecution. The whole reason Gerald Ford pardoned Nixon, which was very controversial, less than a month after succeeding Nixon in the White House, was to make sure that Nixon would not be subjected to the criminal prosecution. So I think Nixon might resign under these circumstances as well, in return, as he did, for some sort of hopeful guarantee that he wouldn't be prosecuted. It's appropriate to prosecute Trump, and I think that's what he's frightened of right now.
You've written about the legacy of American political violence. How do you read this moment we're in? So on the one hand, you have legal accountability for the hundreds who participated in January 6th, the riot. You've had legal accountability for those who tried to kidnap the governor of Michigan, a peaceful midterm election instead of one that was violent. On the other hand, you've had the attack on Paul Pelosi, an armed man arrested outside of Justice Brett Kavanaugh's home. How do you see that balance in the context of our history with violence in America?
Well, one of the points I've tried to make as a historian, John, is that we are a very violent country, and violence has been used repeatedly by groups in our country that don't want to see change or don't want to share power with other groups. And violence has been deployed in the last few years more than any time I remember in my lifetime by members in particular of the Republican Party who have encouraged this violence. Some of them are in Congress right now. And certainly they have not renounced the violence in the way we would expect that they would. So I do think we're seeing more political violence. I think it's a replay of what we saw after the Civil War. It's what I write about in my book, and what we saw in other periods of our history when one group with power is fearful that it is losing that power. Most Americans are not violent. Most of our society's proceedings are not violent, but we have seen a rise in violence, particularly at the local level. And what happened with Nancy Pelosi's husband, I fear we're going to see more of right now.
All right, Jeremi Suri. The book is Civil War by Other Means, America's Long and Unfinished Fight for Democracy. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.